It's me again. Another term needs to be defined and compared to ethnicity, and that is the term nationality, which we will cover just briefly in this lecture. These are the objectives of this lecture. We will discuss the terms and issues shown on this slide. As you see again, I have taken these concepts and have tried to apply them to Africa as we've been talking about in these weeks. First term we have to define is nationality. Let me give you a little background. The political revolutions of the late 1700s, extended, of course, into the 1800s, changed the idea of government by moving away from traditional authority, like kings and dynasties, to the idea that people could establish a legal entity, something we call a state, and swear allegiance to that legal entity rather than to a king or an emperor. This is where the idea of nationality begins to develop in Europe. Nations, with citizenship giving a person certain rights within that nation, began to develop. Italy is a good example. Italy in the 1860s did not exist. They were separate kingdoms, but under political revolution, Garibaldi, separate kingdoms were united into one political unit. The two concepts, nationality and ethnicity, are similar, but we need to distinguish them a little bit more. Ethnicity is defined by cultural elements such as language, religion, shared history, types of food or clothing, whereas nationality is defined by legal obligations to the state, like voting. The reason that they are sometimes confused is that some nations ask their members to disregard adherence to any other cultural characteristics than those of the nation. In other words, substituting things like the national anthem or symbols of the nation rather than cultural symbols of the ethnic group. While American is your nationality, it can also be your culture rather than feeling a strong identity to any particular ethnic group. So let's go back to the example of Italy. When the nation of Italy was first formed, some ethnic groups, mainly the southern groups, did not consider themselves Italians. Many of these people migrated to the United States for economic as well as political reasons. They were grouped by our immigration authorities under the label of, quote, Southern Italians, quote, and were considered inferior to Northern Italians because of their darker skin coloring and lack of education. These people coming into American society then formed strong alliances by living in the same neighborhood, having the same social connections, and of course, we've heard that the term mafia refers to family, which of course was the original meaning. Okay, another important term on this slide is the idea of self-determination. This is a belief system. President Woodrow Wilson was one of the strong adherents of this. He believed that ethnic groups should be allowed to be separate nation states if they wanted to be. In other words, that ethnicities had the right to govern themselves, not to be part of a nation with other ethnicities. So these are sometimes referred to as nation states, a state where the territory corresponds to a particular ethnicity. Again, think in terms of Sudan as we continue to look at what happened in that country. You can see that certain ethnic groups wanted to be separate and by themselves. Nation state or self-determination is sometimes more controversial than it sounds and harder to do. Look at Africa on these two maps. These two maps show us the political divisions before the First World War and after World War I. Most of Africa in both time periods were colonies of European countries. That is, their political boundaries had been determined by another nation, Great Britain, Germany, Belgium, France, etc., who controlled their governments and expected alliance or an allegiance to the home government, that is, to the European governments. After the defeat of Germany in World War I, the political boundaries were redrawn again and allegiances expected to shift to a new home country. Two maps show us the years since these African countries were finally independent of colonial rulers, most after World War II in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. If you look carefully, you can see the dates under the name of each of the countries. These dates indicate when they were actually declared independent nations. The example of Sudan shows us how nationality can be an illusion. The major ethnic divisions were between North and South, the North being the Islamic culture and the South being a Christian and traditional religion cultures. When Great Britain withdrew from the region known as Sudan, they arbitrarily defined the boundaries of the nation of Sudan without concern for the wishes of Southern ethnic groups for self-determination. Almost 40 years of civil wars with incidents of genocide led to the major split. Sudan, and now South Sudan. But the fighting for a national identity continues in South Sudan as the Dinka and Nuer tribes now fight for power. As we go through the semester, we will examine the role of self-determination, again this right of an ethnic group to govern themselves, in the world's ethnic groups, but also the role of multinational states, those where ethnic groups have agreed or have been forced to be part of one nationality. We've already talked about the example of Sudan, where ethnic groups were declared by Great Britain, the authority, to be one nation. But if you go across Africa, you'll see other examples of this, of places where the European colonies had to leave so quickly. They did not have money to sustain colonies and governments in other places. That very little thought was given to where the boundaries should be drawn. And we are continuing to see, even today, at least 50 years later, the consequences of this. Another example, of course, is Russia. When it was the Soviet Union, it was a large collection of multinational states, republics that had been assumed under the Soviet Union's control. And we'll talk about an example of that in a few minutes. Russia, when the Soviet Union broke apart in 1989, some of these republics went independent. Others, there's still some contention about where they should be. Right now, Russia recognizes 21 national republics, and several of them want to be independent, and there have been a lot of controversy, including terrorist acts around the Crimean area, around the area where the Olympics were held in the Soviet Union, the southern part. So we'll talk about some examples of these multinational states. An example of another conflict was the separation of Pakistan from India. After India achieved independence in 1947 as a nation from Great Britain's colonial rule. We will discuss in more detail later, but for now, it can be used as an example of conflict that can result, as it has in Sudan, from the desire for ethnic self-determination by different groups. Another example of conflict today is in the Ukraine. You can see from this map that the southernmost area, the Crimea, consists of a majority of people who ethnically identify themselves as Russian. That's the brown area down at the bottom. The Crimean Peninsula had been part of Russia since 1783. However, in 1954, the then Soviet Union allowed this peninsula to belong to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Exactly why this is done is not clear from the historical records, at least available to me. But in 2014, unrest and civil war in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine allowed Russia to send troops into the Crimea and remove it from Ukraine, establishing two units, the Republic of Crimea and the federal city of Sevastopol. Ukraine and the rest of the world considers this a violation of international law and does not recognize these two units. Russia, however, says that a referendum conducted in 2014 supports the principle of self-determination, as the Russian ethnic people of Crimea voted overwhelmingly to return to Russia. Obviously, this is a conflict that continues even until today, and how it will be resolved and what it will mean for Europe and for U.S.-Russian relations still remains to be seen. But again, an idea based on self-determination. A peaceful and successful multinational state would be Canada, or at least Canada today. The French province of Quebec historically tried to secede from Canada, but economics and loyalty to Canada prevailed. The official national languages of Canada are both English and French. Very often the Prime Minister will speak in both languages giving a speech. Very interesting to watch because he moves back and forth from one to the other. The Indigenous people of Canada, shown on the second map, the map to the right, have also struggled with self-determination, but remain part of the Canadian nation. The same is true of American Indigenous people, the majority of whom live on reservations, the largest being the Navajo Reservation. The majority of these reservations are self-governing, like a state, and many give citizenship rights to those who qualify. It is a complicated situation for Native Americans, which has changed many times since the Europeans arrived in 1492. The important point here is the many ways that people can be identified and the confusion, even conflict, which can result. An interesting question. Is the U.S. a multinational state? This discussion may seem difficult or strange to those who are used to the idea of ethnicity and nationality as we think of it in the United States. Here, while people are allowed and even encouraged to identify with an ethnic group, they see nationality as something different, or do they? Considering the census form we looked at earlier, there may be some confusion here too. It is also difficult for us to imagine a time when the state you lived in was more important than loyalty to the United States, an idea that ended with the Civil War. Or did it? But not least is the idea of citizenship, when a person has certain rights and responsibilities in the nation, the right to vote, to run for office, other aspects of political life, and protection by his country for certain rights. There are two ways that citizenship is obtained. One by birth, and the second by the legal process, sometimes known as naturalization. With this global map, you see something interesting. The right of citizenship by birth exists only in the countries of the New World. However, even there, the US and Canada are the only two countries which allow this citizenship birth, even if the parents are illegally in the country. If you're interested in exploring more about this, since it's a controversial issue today and in the news almost every day, see the article in the link provided on this slide for more discussion of United States citizenship. If a person is not born in those countries that are shown in black, then they can go through a naturalization process to obtain citizenship. This process of naturalization varies in each country and in those countries around the world which do not allow citizenship by birth. Some nations allow a person to maintain more than one citizenship, but some do not. Some require that the parents have citizenship when a child applies. Some nations allow children to apply, but most require a person to be at least 18 years of age. Saudi Arabia rarely allows foreigners to become citizens and has a religious requirement also. Summary of the points that we have discussed in this video. As usual, if you have any questions or if you want to ask me anything about this PowerPoint presentation, please just send me a note through the inbox on Canvas or through my El Camino email. We will continue to discuss these ideas as we move around the world throughout the semester.